Olympiad. Asking them consistently, they are trying out to use their own brain.
Hi. We just
Okay.
starting now.
All right. That's a key thing I'm looking.
I have very privileged to passing out the new education system. I will first of all ensure such system is the ICT based. And all schools will have the required infrastructure. Because I've discovered that there is a disconnect between the institutions and the world. And that is why our education system is like this. We do not apply anything in the industry, in the environment, we do all these things. So our education system must think the ICT based.
Thank you very much. So I would say that what we have said, I was thinking after that for to start doing that. Not wait till the government to do all of this, but in our own various and ensure that we implement it. And also make sure that the learning, what students are learning, is connected to real life, not so disconnected and then where will I that can even see. So lastly, I would like to encourage us that it is possible for us to have students, it's possible for each of us here to make students that will make it in their life. It's possible and it will happen. And I know that one of the teachers, that we are here today shows that we really care about our students and see us and hope that we see the kind of future that we hope to see for all of us. Thank you very much for listening.
Very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Bill. Oh my God. I have to we have another speaker. Thank you very much for the insightful.
Miss Ali has been with us because of this since yesterday, and she's traveling back. She's leaving this town right now. Thank you very much again. And
For every speech that we have listened to, we are going to share the slides with you, don't worry. You are going to receive all the slides.
once you have your email address, So Professor Mrs. Ilana Horn is around, and we are going to be joining her now. You need the sound. Hi, we are.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. Are you projecting the slides?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's really an honor to be able to speak with teachers in the country of Nigeria, which I know has produced so much incredible culture and scholarship over the years. So it's really my honor to be speaking with the teachers today. If we look at slide 2, I'm going to give a quick overview of my talk. I'm going to just briefly tell you what I study and how I study it. Then I'll give you some highlights of what I've learned, particularly about how good teachers differ from great teachers. It's a subtle difference, but it's an important difference, and it's something we can all work toward. And I'll end by speaking to how teacher community can really help us all go from good to great. Okay, on slide 3, and then 4, what I study. I study mostly mathematics teachers learning. I've looked at teachers in other content areas, but primarily my area is mathematics education. But the reason why I study learning and teacher learning in particular is because any educational improvement effort that we make has teacher learning at its center and at its core. Whether we want to talk about adopting a new curriculum, whether we want to talk about responding to needs of different learners, all of those things depend on the teacher's understanding and ability to execute different kinds of teaching practices. So teacher learning is really, really a critical part of education, and something that, in my opinion, doesn't get talked about often enough. So the way I study teacher learning on slide 5 and 6 is a little bit different than how teacher learning has been studied historically. I study teacher learning by listening to teachers talk about teaching. So this is kind of an anthropological view of learning. I look at what actually is happening in schools and in classrooms. Most of the time, teacher learning has been studied using either classroom observation studies with like pre and post measures of teachers' practice, or surveys where teachers self-report what they do in their classroom. So like you can see an example of the kinds of surveys on slide 7. But on slide 8, I explain why I listen to teachers talk. I can hear things in how they talk that is closer to what they're actually doing in the classroom. I can hear things like how they define problems in teaching, and then importantly, how they think about addressing these problems. I can also see things that have to do with the contexts and situations that they work in. I can see the resources they have, whether it's colleagues or materials or a supportive administrator, and limitations they face. And that you can imagine the limitations. There are many limitations teachers face in schools. What I've learned so far on slide 10, I really, because my focus has been on teachers' conversations with each other, I'm thinking about how they learn through these conversations. And the things in the conversations that seem relevant to the learning opportunities they provide are things like the problem frames that they use for identifying issues. And don't worry, I will explain what each of these are. If you don't understand, that's okay. So the problem frames they use for identifying issues, the representations of instruction that come out in their conversations, and the interpretive principles that they use in understanding problems of practice. So let me start by explaining problem frames. When I talk about problem frames, what I mean is how teachers name and describe the issues that they encounter. For example, when some students finish their classwork before other students do, some teachers might see that as an issue of, well, some students are faster than others, and treat it as just merely an issue of ability. Other teachers might say, the students who finished more quickly weren't thinking carefully about their work, and maybe they need extra challenge to go deeper into the content. So it's not that the underlying phenomenon is so much different, but how teachers view it and how they then address it really matters for how they make sense of their teaching practice. And that's what problem frames mean. By representations of instruction, I'm talking about how teachers bring the classroom to their conversations with colleagues. So one of the things that's challenging about teaching and teacher learning with colleagues that's different than other professions is that the opportunities we have for consultation with colleagues usually happen outside of the active work of teaching. So if I have a difficult class and I want to talk to a colleague, I can't import every salient detail of that class, of that lesson to talk to my colleagues about. So I'm going to either tell a story, I might bring a lesson plan, I might bring a sample of student work. All of these things are ways of representing instruction, because I have to do that in order to get my colleague on the same page with me. So that's what representations of instruction are. By interpretive principles, as teachers talk and describe the problems of practice to their colleagues, they often make these statements that assert how things are. So for example, these are things, I don't know if they say these in Nigeria or not, but these are things I've heard teachers say in the US. You have to start out strict when you have a new class, and then you can lighten up once the students get to know you. So that's it. That's a statement of how things are in teaching. Another statement of how things are. You never know what you're going to get when you go into your classroom every day. So both of those statements offer kind of views of teaching and what teaching is and what it involves. And when we talk with colleagues, we hear these kinds of assertions and we can either agree, disagree, or argue with them. But these are the kinds of resources that when teachers talk with colleagues, come together to make learning opportunities. So now I'm going to go to the next section about how great teachers differ from good teachers. So using these three things and listening to teachers' conversations and looking at their practice, I've been able to sort of tease apart how really outstanding teachers who manage to reach all kids more consistently, who manage to have lively classroom discussions, who manage to really bring rich representations of content to their students on a consistent basis. How do they differ from good teachers? Well, the problem frames that they use when they're diagnosing problems of practice are actionable. So instead of saying something like, the student can't do this because he's too lazy, there's nothing you can do as a teacher other than reprimand a student or give them a poor grade if they're not doing their work because they're lazy. It's not actionable. So really great teachers will try to get behind and underneath that lazy impression and say, I don't think he yet knows the routines of the classroom. So then that becomes something that's actionable because they can have a conversation with the student about checking in to make sure that they understand that when they come in, they're supposed to do this and that the homework works in this way and so on. When great teachers share representations of practice in consultation with their colleagues, they also tell the stories of their classroom in ways that include more student voice and take on the student's perspective. So when they're talking about a lesson that doesn't go well, they might imagine what was going on from students' perspectives instead of just from their teacher's perspective. When they share interpretive principles with their colleagues, they don't just talk about either the content or the teaching or the student understanding. They look at how those things connect. The students, I introduced a task that started with forgot how to do them. So I went back and I calmed them down. So it's a story that little story I just told talks about the teaching, about the student's reaction. It gives a perspective of why the students had that reaction, and then starts to tell about how the teacher responded. So it's that kind of connection among those different things. So the way I would describe on slide 16, what the differences are with these things is that great teachers really have a heightened sense of teacher agency. Those actionable problem frames really show that they have a sense of what they can do, and they really focus on what they can do. And there's not much in the way of helplessness in the face of the problems that come up in their classrooms. In terms of representations of practice, by taking on the student perspective and emphasizing it, as they're making sense of what goes on in the teaching, they engage in what I call empathic reasoning, in that they're taking on students' perspectives as they're making sense of things. And then finally, that last one of really emphasizing these connections across the teaching, the content, and students' experiences and understanding. It's kind of an ecological thinking of the classroom. A lot of times, educational improvement is talked about as just sort of a component by component thing. Like, if you take this curriculum and use it, this magic will happen. Or if you use this teaching instructional practice, magic will happen. But experienced teachers know that it's not just any one thing that makes or breaks a lesson. It's the interplay of all the things. And so really great teachers consider all those facets at once. Sometimes the analogy that I give is, I don't know if babies in Nigeria ever play with mobiles. Do you know what mobiles are? I wish I could see your faces. But if you look up a mobile, if you aren't familiar with them, they're like these balance toys, and you pull one end of a mobile and the other ones move. And that's sort of how really great teachers think about the classroom. They think about these interconnectedness, and how if you change a lesson, if you change the curriculum, students will have different experiences, students will have different access to content. So they think about all those connections between them. So taking those three things about problem frames being actionable, representations of practice, including more student voice and more student perspective, and interpretive principles focusing on those inner connections. Part of what we've found is that really strong teacher communities can support teachers' greatness. How does this happen? Well, it doesn't happen just by putting teachers in a room together. That doesn't do it. It has to do with the quality of conversation. And the quality of conversation shifts from, I don't know your country, I haven't visited your school, so I don't know if this is true in Nigeria the way it is in the US and other Western countries. But a lot of times in our country, the way teachers talk to each other about instruction is using what I would call tips and tricks. So if somebody says, I'm having trouble with, your teacher will give a tip. So it's not really much of a dialogue. It's more like, here's a solution that's worked for me. So here's an example of, on slide 21, of a teacher community, an exchange I saw in a teacher community that I would characterize as a tips and tricks kind of exchange. So Charmaine says, okay, so we're on unit 3. And Devin says, yes, ma'am. And Charmaine says, I never taught this one before. How should we get started? And Devin says, well, what I do is, okay, open your book and turn to your partner. And he continues to act out the lesson. So that is a demonstration. It gives Charmaine something to do in her classroom, but it's pretty one way in terms of the exchange of information. On slide 22, I contrast this with a teacher team that is going in more depth in their dialogue. This is just the very beginning of what was a very long conversation. The team is examining the student work and trying to understand one student's error. And Shonda says, I think he got confused using the calculator, like he accidentally put a 0. And Deanna, looking at the same work, says, yeah. And Shonda starts interpreting it and saying, I think he mostly has the concept. And Lindsay interjects, she pushes back. She says, well, I'm not sure he gets the concept. It seems he gets the procedure. So this is an exchange of ideas where there's a little bit of disagreement as the teachers are working together to interpret this piece of student work. So like I said, this was the beginning of a much longer conversation where the teachers really worked together to build a shared understanding of what was going on with the student and his thinking. So in-depth conversations, if this becomes a regular feature of teacher community, they give teachers interpretive resources for their classroom instruction. They can activate or model these features of great teaching, of teacher agency, of empathic reasoning, and ecological thinking. If we take that last in-depth conversation, by understanding that the student doesn't yet understand the concept, but only understands the procedure, that gives his teacher something actionable to do in her instruction of him to make sure he better understands the concept. The empathic reasoning of looking at what a student does and what that means about his understanding is also really important to the interpretation of the student work. Later in the conversation, they start discussing Shonda's instruction and why she thinks that the student left with just a procedural understanding and not the deeper understanding. So that was ecological thinking because she was able to connect aspects of her instruction to what the student ended up taking away. We found in some longer research that when teachers regularly have these kinds of in-depth conversations, that there's kind of a spillover effect in terms of the learning that they're able to do with colleagues, because not only do they learn to seek advice and improve their practice in exchange with each other, but they also develop stronger advice seeking relationships outside of meetings. So if teachers have these opportunities to learn from each other in formal teacher community meetings, they will then go and seek each other out, even if the meetings end. We found that that lasts for quite a long time. So that is my brief presentation. I don't know if we have time for a question or two, but I'd love to hear from you if that's possible.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Very insightful and it's been instructive. Now, like I explained before, we had some technical difficulties. And I hope that since we have your handle here, some of these teachers can engage on some of the personal questions that you have. They can shoot you some emails. I hope you'll be willing to respond to them if you have such. Maybe they engage via your social media. Did you get me? Hello, can you hear me as well?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I explained that your session was insightful, instructive also, and educational. And right now, we are unable to take questions because we are running very, very behind schedule.
Okay.
So we hope that if our teachers reach out to you.
That would be lovely. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your conference.
Thank you very much.
What we're learning about how to get tools that you can use to create content. You know, being a digital artist, I told you before, don't just say it's bad. You can be teaching people creating content, your mathematics, your history. You can be teaching it in big size content, and you are sharing it with the world, and the world can teach it back. So you don't, you also going to be telling how you can take global opportunities available for teachers, serving experiences, connect with people across, to achieve learning. They're going to be having first session tomorrow. Then also, they're going to be having a very important session, final session. You want to be able to. They are told you integrate ICT training when public schools that are visible. How can you start? We really want you to get started. Then we have that session, teacher to teacher session. The person that teaching you will not sit down to cohort for a group. If you sit down, you may see someone that is a group on how teachers can learn to use it. You may find your cohort, you may find yourself, your educational business, you find it. So there's a need for that to happen. I promise you tomorrow, by God's grace, we are starting 9 a.m. and from the start to finish, we will not have any reason to by God's grace. Thank you very much for coming. Okay, yes, we are having also a session on online safety tomorrow. How to be safe online. That they will not continue to steal your money or hurt you. Or how you can help your children, your students, when they go online, they don't get to the wrong place or the wrong one. We will introduce this to first thing tomorrow. It will be hands-on session and it will start. Okay, so we also want you to tomorrow, we love you to tell your friends about this. We have our social media handle. We will send an information, the message to you on tomorrow. For people who are left, they need to know about this and some other information. So our social handle on Facebook, we are SSGHF. You can't see that, okay. We will communicate all of that again tomorrow. So see you tomorrow. Okay. Yes. Quick information. So for some of us that are registered, please come with your tag tomorrow. It's going to be part of the registration. Actually, registration criteria, entry criteria. Second thing, we plan in the late part to provide something initiative. But the provision changes thanks to efforts, you know, and I want to say that tomorrow, by God's grace, we will transmit what we get to today. I appreciate how you take the talk through her. God bless you so much. See you tomorrow, 9 a.m. Yes, we'll be having this party session tomorrow. If you want to appear on our videos, you know, so that the world can see that, oh, you are getting a teacher training. Yes. And there will be, by God's grace, there are a lot of things to access tomorrow. So you may be allowed to take a few pictures if you like, take a few pictures with the person you have met or whatever.
Instagram. Oh, this one is the same for Facebook, Instagram, yes, and Twitter. No, Facebook, yeah, Instagram, yes. Twitter. LinkedIn. Twitter is different.